What's happening, sweet angels? Trumpeter and composer Bobby Spellman here to welcome you to the 9th episode in our series on the Lydian Chromatic concept of tonal organization. As you know, the foundational principle of the Lydian Chromatic concept is the idea of tonal gravity. And in his book, George Russell outlines 3 levels of tonal gravity: vertical tonal gravity, horizontal tonal gravity, and supravertical tonal gravity. Now, up until this point in the series, we have been primarily discussing the level of vertical tonal gravity, which deals with understanding parent scales and the relationships of various modes and chords in a vertical setting. However, in this episode, I wanted to do an overview of the level of horizontal tonal gravity and discuss some of the ways that you can use it in your improvisations and compositions on this exciting episode of Theory with Bob. All right, in the Lydian Chromatic concept, George Russell outlined 3 levels of tonal gravity, which he felt were always in a state of coexistence to various degrees. And they are, once again, vertical, horizontal, and supravertical tonal gravity. Now, the Lydian Chromatic concept is filled with space-age jargon that I think at times can be a deterrent to people who are interested in learning more about the theory. So throughout this series, I've been trying to avoid using language that is too esoteric. But if you want to get knee-deep in some wild jargon, you can check out the book itself, pick up a copy of the book. If you've already made it to episode 9, let's go buy a copy of the book and check it out. It's interesting. However, I think the best way that I can describe the difference between vertical tonal gravity and horizontal tonal gravity is that if you are operating in the level of vertical tonal gravity, the melody is going to color the chords, whereas if you're operating on the level of horizontal tonal gravity, the chords are going to color the melody. So, George Russell described the difference between vertical playing and horizontal playing as the difference between Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young. Those were the 2 musicians that he used as particular examples of using vertical playing versus horizontal playing. So, Coleman Hawkins, for example, playing over Body and Soul, you can hear the way that Coleman Hawkins was outlining each of the chords of the moment. Whereas Lester Young, though he certainly could think vertically and could play vertically, was largely thinking of using major scales, which George Russell described as horizontal scales, over a series of chords to resolve to a final chord or tonic station. So in horizontal tonal gravity, generally speaking, what you're dealing with is a horizontal scale resolving to a final chord of a particular phrase. So, for example, a C major scale will resolve typically to a C major chord, an A minor scale will resolve typically to an A minor chord. So another example of the difference between vertical and horizontal would be John Coltrane's solo on Giant Steps is a very vertical solo because all of the melodies he's creating relate closely to the underlying chord of the moment, whereas a lot of, for example, rock music deals with primarily horizontal tonal gravity because what you have is a major or minor scale melody that is being colored by, let's say, a 4-chord chord progression that will eventually resolve to a major or minor chord, typically speaking. So before we get into the specifics of horizontal tonal gravity, I think it'd be useful to go over what George Russell described as the 4 horizontal scales in his principal scales. And there you have the major scale, you have the major with a flat 7 that we know as Mixolydian, you have a major with a sharp 5, and you have a certain variation on the blues scale. Now, in all of these situations, George Russell made a distinction between these horizontal scales and vertical modes because the horizontal scales include the 4th degree in the major scale or the flat 6 in the minor scale. So certainly the most common horizontal scale that we hear in Western music is the major scale or its relative minor scale. So, for example, C major, C Ionian, and A minor, A Aeolian. Those scales we often hear as wanting to resolve the behavior of the scale. It wants to resolve to its tonic 1 major or 6 minor chord, which is described as George Russell as tonic stations. So to distinguish once again between vertical playing and horizontal playing, you can imagine if you were playing over rhythm changes, for example, a vertical approach, the level of vertical tonal gravity, would deal with playing each chord in the moment and trying to outline each of those chords. So let's say we're in the key of B flat. That would be hitting the B flat major to G7 or G minor 7 to C minor 7 to F7, trying to hit each of the notes in those chords and try to outline the chords with the melody, whereas playing in a more horizontal fashion would be to just play the B flat major scale over all of the chords in the A section and allow the chords to color the scale until you eventually resolve to the B flat major chord at the end of the form. Now, in the level of horizontal tonal gravity, a horizontal scale can resolve to one of three tonic station chords. So the tonic station chords are going to be the chords at the end of a musical phrase. Typically speaking, if you were in the key of C major, the most likely end would be to resolve to a C major chord. That would be the same chord that is the modal tonic of the horizontal melody. So a C major scale would typically resolve to a C major chord, and A minor scale would typically resolve to an A minor chord. However, those scales can also resolve to different chords as a tonic station chord resolving at the end of a phrase, and those final chords in the phrase could either be sharp lying or flat lying to that major scale or minor scale melody, depending on the context. So that's a little confusing. Let me slow that down and explain that in terms that we'll use examples so that it makes it a little bit easier to understand. If I'm playing a melody in C major, but the final chord of a phrase is, for example, a B flat major chord or an E flat major chord, that's going to have a much more suspended, floaty kind of sound because that resolving chord is 2 or 3/5 in a flat direction from the modal tonic of the major scale that we're dealing with, C major. Similarly, if we have a C major scale, but the final chord in a phrase would be, for example, D major or A major, that's going to have a much brighter sound within the context of the phrase because that D major and A major chord, either one is going to be either 2 or 3/5 in a sharp direction around the circle of fifths from the modal tonic of the major scale, the C major scale. Now, when improvising, you always want to be aware of the vertical relationship between the melodies that you're playing and the underlying chords. However, when you're dealing in the horizontal level of tonal gravity, you're primarily focusing on using major or minor scales or various horizontal scales to create melodies that will eventually resolve to the final chord of the phrase or of the piece. Now, once again, this is extremely common in rock and pop music. Very often you will have a melody that is in a major or minor key and then a series of chords that color that melody and eventually typically resolve to the tonic chord of a piece. Generally speaking, this is maybe the most common level of tonal gravity, but I wanted to make sure that we covered the vertical tonal gravity, both because it's the subject that is primarily covered in Volume 1 of the Lydian Chromatic Concept of Tonal Organization, and it's also pertinent to jazz musicians who are often thinking vertically when trying to improvise over a piece of music. All right, so in order to illustrate the sound of horizontal tonal gravity, I wrote you a tune, and I performed it with some of my friends, and I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea of what to look for in this tune so that you can hear the way that you can use horizontal tonal gravity and the way that it works in a piece of music. So I wrote this piece in the key of E minor, so the melody is all in E minor. However, the chords are going to change under the melody and are going to color the melody. You'll hear the way that the melody is the key of the melody. It's a very horizontal sounding E minor sound, so it wants to resolve to that E minor chord as the tonic station. But as it goes, I'm using different chords in the harmony to color that melody. Now, in the first system, it's a 16-bar tune. In the first 4 bars, the end of the first 4 bars is going to resolve to an E minor chord, which is conventional. That's what you'd expect, that E minor scale resolving to an E minor chord. In the second system, at the end of the second 4 bars, the chords will resolve, the E minor scale will resolve to a C7 sharp 11 chord, which is going to come from, if E minor is coming from, or the E minor tonic station would be from G Lydian, the E minor coming from G Lydian, that C7 sharp 11 is going to come from B flat Lydian augmented, which is 3/5 in a flat direction around the circle of fifths. So you're going to hear a much more suspended sound at the end of the second system. Then, at the end of the third system, I have put a sharp lying chord, so that E minor melody is going to resolve to an A major 9 chord, which is 2/5 in a sharp direction around the circle of fifths from where our ears would expect to hear that scale resolve, which is going to give it a very bright sound at the end of the third system. And finally, at the end of the piece, I resolved it once again to an E minor chord so that you can hear the way that that E minor horizontal scale is going to resolve to its E minor tonic station. Now, after that, I'm going to take 2 choruses of solo. The first chorus I played vertically, and the second chorus I played horizontally. So I did this in order for you to be able to hear the difference between vertical playing and horizontal playing. So just to give you a little idea of what I was doing, in the first 16 bars of my solo, I'm going to be playing coloring the chords with the melody. So I'm using certain melodies that will outline the specific modes that are most in unity with the underlying chords. And then in the second chorus of my solo, I played mostly in E minor. So I'm always aware of what's happening with the underlying chords, but at the same time, I'm establishing E minor and that E minor horizontal sound as being sort of the dominant sound in the piece, so that the chords end up coloring the melody that I'm playing, and that will eventually resolve to the various tonic stations at the end of each phrase of the piece. All right, so without further ado, you can check that out, get a little bit of a sense for the difference between vertical playing and horizontal playing and the way that you can write horizontal melodies, and that sounds a little something like this. All right, gang, and there you have it. Horizontal scales typically include the 4 in the major scales and the flat 6 in the minor scales, which give the scale the feeling of forward motion resolving to a major or minor tonic station chord. Now, you can use this in your own improvisations. If you identify what the tonic station, what the final chord of a phrase is, you can use the major or minor scale over a series of chords and allow those chords to color the melody that you're playing. Once again, it's helpful to understand what's going on in the sort of vertical structure of each of the chords. However, you can get away with a lot playing major scales, because even in the melody that I wrote, there's a couple of notes that we would consider wrong notes, but because our ears are gravitating towards the sound of the major or minor horizontal scale, it's not as egregious as if you're just playing a clam over a particular vertical structure. Anyway, so you can try playing different ways using these sort of a more horizontal approach or a more vertical approach. Typically speaking, they coexist and you can use them interchangeably in your improvisations and in your compositions. Now, there's one more level of tonal gravity that we could discuss. Either one of these, horizontal or supravertical, could be the basis for an entire series of videos. However, my goal with this is not to get into every little detail of the Lydian chromatic concept, but to give an overview so that you can better understand what's going on in terms of the foundations. Maybe later on I will do some more videos on horizontal and supravertical tonal gravity, and you can let me know if you have any questions about those, or if you'd like to hear or see more videos on that in the future down in the comments below. But supravertical tonal gravity basically has to do with the entire key of the piece, or the tonality, or the mode, or in the case of Schoenberg and other atonal musics, the idea that the whole piece of music is atonal. So if you're dealing with, for example, Fela Kuti's music, typically speaking, he'll just have one chord in a song. You could regard that as primarily the sort of dominant level of tonal gravity in that context would be the supravertical tonal gravity. It would be the same thing with a lot of Schoenberg's music because you've got 12 tone. It would be kind of impractical, generally speaking, to primarily analyze some of that music from a vertical standpoint or a horizontal standpoint. It might make more sense to look at it from a supravertical standpoint, which again is just dealing with the entire mode or key that the piece is based on. All right, gang, and with that, I hope you had some fun with that episode. I hope you can try some of these ideas out and try to hear the differences between horizontal tonal gravity and vertical tonal gravity and see if you can incorporate these ideas into your playing and into your writing. Stick around for one more episode in our Lydian Chromatic series, and then I'm going to do an episode answering some questions. I may have some more episodes down the line discussing some specifics of the Lydian Chromatic concept, but that will bring us to the end of our 10-part series. If you like this video, give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and have a wonderful time playing with sounds, improvising, and composing, and we'll catch you on the next one. See ya. Theory with Bob. All right, gang, thanks so much for checking out this video. We hope it helps in your quest for the majesty of musical self-expression. The Ridgewood School of Music is currently accepting new students for lessons online or in person in the Brooklyn, Queens, and New York City area. If you'd like us to help set you up with the perfect teacher for the instrument or style that you're interested in studying, you can find us on our website at www.ridgewoodschoolofmusic.com, or you can shoot us an email at ridgewoodschoolofmusic@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this video and you would like to support the creation of new videos like this one, you can find us on our Patreon at patreon.com/ridgewoodschoolofmusic. There, as a subscriber to the Patreon, you can gain access to bonus content, including bonus videos, exercises in improvisation and different instruments, as well as bonus transcription videos. So, if you'd like to help support the creation of new videos like this one, find us on our Patreon, and it's a real big help. All right, gang, have a wonderful time practicing, and we'll catch you on the next one. See ya. Okay.